Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the National Museum of Scotland for this afternoon's lecture in our Understanding Technology series, which is presented in cooperation with Edinburgh University's Institute for the Study of Science, Technology and Innovation. I'm Alex Hayward, Keeper of Science and Technology here, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Tim Boon, who's Head of Research and Public History at the Science Museum Group, which is based at the Science Museum in South Kensington, London. And there Tim leads the department which is the Science Museum's coordinating home for everything related to academic research, and which underpins that museum's continuing commitment to studying and preserving its world-class collections, as well as gaining greater understanding of its audiences. Collections which, of course, are second only to the collections assembled by George Wilson starting some months before the foundation of the South Kensington. Sorry. Tim has worked at the Science Museum in various roles since 1982 and is an author of many publications. One particularly germane, I think, in some ways to this afternoon is Films of Fact, A History of Science in Documentary Films and Television, which was published in 2008. Now, I've known Tim as a friend and a colleague for over a quarter of a century, and last worked together with him on the Science Museum's splendidly ambitious gallery, Making the Modern World, which provided multifaceted insights into the development of the industrialised world. I've long admired his thoughtful insights into science, museums and culture, and so I'm really looking forward to his lecture this afternoon. Science on television and in the museum comparisons. Tim, you're very welcome.
Well, Alex, thank you very much for those kind words, and thanks also to Klaus, especially for making it possible for me to be here today. Today's talk is part of a research programme that looks historically at the post-war public culture of science. This line of work aims to understand the media by which adults in the recent past have encountered science, not singly, medium by medium, but in comparison, so as to grasp the place of science in the broader culture. At this stage, this is a study of science television compared with science museum displays, where exhibitions are treated as a medium like any other, whilst noting their distinct characteristics. I should also note that this is very much a supply-side analysis. Of course, audience reception deserves serious attention, but I cannot do both today. This body of work aims to proceed following the descriptive approach of the historian rather than the inevitably prescriptive angle of what has variously been called public understanding of science and science engagement, but more of that later. And I should provide some explanation of where the subject of today's talk comes from, following the old historiographical principle of understanding who the historian is before you hear the history. Alex has anticipated this a little bit. I believe that accident has placed me in a rather unusual position that permits me to ask some questions that might well not occur to others. I've been a curator at the Science Museum in London for more than 30 years. Arriving with half a degree in the history of science, it wasn't long before I returned to part-time academic study. And when it came to selecting the topic for a doctorate, I turned to study something I dealt with in my job, namely old science films, because I used to program the museum's film shows. So it was that in 1989, I embarked on a study of the history of science documentaries, which soon narrowed to a thesis on interwar health education films before broadening out, for my book, Films of Fact, brief plug. Still in print. That book, you can get it for £4.32 from Amazon, I noticed yesterday. That book looks at how science and technology were represented in documentary films and television between 1903 and 1965. But all the time I was doing this work, I was also a participant in the history of the Science Museum. In 2009, I had the chance to reflect on that period as a historian when I wrote my chapter of the museum's history essays, Science for the Nation. And my chapter looks at the Science Museum from around 1980 up to the millennium. The workaday historian's tools I had sharpened on old science documentaries were now useful for telling institutional history. A couple of years ago, it occurred to me that it would make sense to bring the museum and moving image media into the same frame. The opportunity came in 2012 when we successfully bid for an AHRC Exploratory Award under their Science and Culture theme. The Science Museum was awarded funding for a 6-month project to draw comparisons between museum displays and television programmes. I was fortunate to be able to employ the researcher Jean-Baptiste Goyon, who is an expert in natural history films, and together we set about looking at what happened in the museum in the 1950s and 60s when television became the dominant vector by which science was communicated to the public. I make no secret of my starting assumption that the Science Museum would come off worse in the comparison, that compared with the youthful and lively medium of television, the museum would seem hidebound and tired. Well, as the song says, you always hurt the one you love. It has often been assumed that any new medium, here television, will usurp the place of the old, in this case, museums. Similarly, cinema was expected to damage theatre, TV to destroy cinema, or again, the arrival of VHS was expected to jeopardize going to the flicks. But as we know in all those cases, the story is much more complex than the new simply superseding the old. In our case today, as I will discuss a little later, the museum turned out to be rather impressive in its practice. Furthermore, new media compete in very complex ways with old, and here the intrinsic features of a time-based medium are in no simple sense a substitute for the specific aspects of displays in three-dimensional space. In the rest of my talk, I'm going to cover several aspects of the topic suggested by my title. So my first section is about science television in the 1950s and early 1960s. I'll briefly compare this with some generalizations about the history of the Science Museum in the same period. And that gives me enough context briefly to present the result of our Science and Culture project. But I want to be more ambitious today than simply reporting that older study. So in the second half, I want to speculate about a later period, jumping to consider the comparative fortunes of the Science Museum and science on television from the 1980s onwards. In a brief conclusion, I'll draw out a comparison between these two eras as a way to outline some directions for further research. In Britain, television really only got going in the 1950s. The pre-war television service only served a small number of comparatively well-off Londoners and was very much treated as the minor, younger sibling of radio. Television broadcasting stopped across the war and only recommenced in summer 1946. But the expansion from 1950 was dramatic, with the traditional milestone of 1953's coronation being a fair marker for the increased influence of the medium. Across the 1950s, television executives sought to establish forms of programs that were intrinsically televisual. And that meant, in the main, an emphasis on live television, as against broadcasting films made in advance of broadcast. The first long-standing regular science program was called Ion Research, and it ran between 1957 and 1962. Each week, this program reported on a particular field of science by taking live, outside broadcast cameras to various research establishments, just as its sister program, Your Life in Their Hands, went into hospitals. The first 10-part series of Ion Research included programs broadcast from the Motor Industry Research Association, the Atomic Energy Research Association, and Manchester University to meet that novelty, a computer. One whole series of 10 programs in 1960, marking the tercentenary of the Royal Society, featured fellows of the Society, those elite figures of the scientific establishment, including Martin Ryle, Max Perutz, John Kendrew, and Nicholas Curti. It was the use of the outside broadcast that was distinctive about Ion Research. I mean, there had been science on television before 1957, plenty of it, but it tended to be either very studio-bound or, as complete documentary films, which were just put through the telecine machine. So I think it's time for our first treat. So I'm going to show you a couple of minutes of one of the ION research programs from 1960. I'm showing you a recording, but that was exactly what happened on that evening in 1960 when that program went out. This is a live program, and there are about 45 of these programs. Most of them were recorded to film because they were considered, or the argument was made that they were so significant that they should be recorded. Of the dozen or so I've seen, I think this is the most remarkable. During the course of a program which is precisely half an hour in length, they fire up the apparatus. They get it pretty close to absolute zero. I mean, Curtie's terribly disappointed because he can't get it as far as he wants to. Meanwhile, they're ducking and diving around the Cavendish lab with a couple of huge cameras, recording interviews with Curtie and with various of his colleagues. It's the most extraordinary bit of mise en scène. It's very daring television. Perhaps that's a little bit hidden to us now because it's in slightly fuzzy black and white. But it is the most extraordinary, exhilarating piece of television. And the producers just love this sense of the simultaneous, that it's live television, that anything could go wrong. That, for them, is the nature of television. So ION research was a current affairs approach to science in keeping with its live television aesthetic. Aubrey Singer, who was the editor of the series, wrote in the Radio Times, "Nowadays, science affects everyone. We cannot ignore the implications of rapid technological developments. Research paves the way towards tomorrow's new industrial techniques and materials. ION research is an effort to keep you abreast of the times by people who are ahead of the times." Technically, the programme explored a niche created by the BBC's extensive purchase of outside broadcasting equipment to cover regional sporting fixtures at weekends. The equipment was underemployed on weekdays, so producers were encouraged to find uses for it. And this led to programmes such as ION Research, which they called built outside broadcast programmes. That is, those that didn't merely televise existing events, like the coronation, but actually went into outside venues and turned them into studios for programmes constructing the developing grammar of television. And for Aubrey Singer, who was a very ambitious outside broadcaster, ION Research was in a direct line of development from his first extraordinary programme, which was called The Restless Sphere, which went out in summer 1957, just a few months before ION Research started. And this was a breakthrough programme. This was a one-off special to mark the start of the International Geophysical Year, which is really the beginning of climate science. The programme was introduced by BBC grandee Richard Dimbleby. The programme was presented from the studio by Prince Philip and featured a remarkable and ambitious total of 3 overseas and 2 United Kingdom live outside broadcast feeds. They had cameras in all those places during this 1.5-hour programme. You can see it on YouTube. It was put out because it's got Prince Philip in it. So whilst built outside broadcasts were not entirely new in 1957, previous incarnations of the form had been relatively unambitious. A curator tour of the Science Museum's new Aeronautics Gallery, for example, was one. But Singer had fixed upon the International Geophysical Year as the vehicle to pursue his televisual ambitions, after somebody in the talks department had deemed it impossible to turn into interesting television. Singer, the outside broadcaster, saw here the opportunity to establish a new mode of television that would compete with studio-based programming. No one knows really why Singer went into science television. He seems just to have seized this opportunity. He was new back in the country, he was new back in the outside broadcast department at the beginning of 1957, and he seized upon science as the vehicle for his career, and he's the key figure in the first, from 1957 right through for at least a decade. So in the case of the programme I've been showing you, Ion Research, it was, for Singer, a matter of developing a successful production model of science broadcasting on the basis of the restless sphere prototype. Okay, let's switch medium. Like the BBC television service, the Science Museum was closed to the public during the Second World War, when it was requisitioned for military use, and it reopened to the public in February 1946, just ahead of the telly being switched back on. The first of several transformative directors of the post-war period was Frank Sherwood Taylor, in whose 5 years at the helm, he died in office, there was a turn to broader social history than had been normal in the museum, with the establishment of collections in agriculture and domestic technology, for example, and the building of an iconography collection, including, notably, Colebrook Dale by Night, which was very controversial within the museum. Sherwood Taylor also brought in a new focus on the investigation and practice of education. He employed a London University psychologist, Philip Vernon, to conduct a study of how people learnt in museums. Sherwood Taylor advocated instruction through pleasure and invited curators to get inspiration for exhibition technique from shop counter display, the strip cartoon, the variegated techniques of advertising, radio, television, the cinema, and the stage. Bill O'Day, one of the most influential display-minded curators and responsible for the Agriculture Gallery, which is still there, stated that the art of the curator is to beguile, and by so doing, to educate. The picture that emerged from the Science and Culture research project we did a couple of years ago is clear, that on the one hand, the new medium of television over the 20 years from 1946 had, as the producer Norman Swallow argued at the time, forged its own techniques, developing its own form of journalism, and learning the best ways of presenting the world to the world. In the mid-60s, television was still a new medium. But on the other hand, in the same period, staff at the Science Museum were also active, reflecting on and developing their own medium. So let me go into one instance in more detail. And this comes direct from our research project. Henry Calvert, keeper of the Science Museum's Department of Astronomy and Geophysics, wrote a memo in 1950 detailing his approach to the presentation of technical information in the Science Museum. In this note, he reflected on how displays should be constructed to convey technical information to visitors. At the outset, he insisted on the importance of meeting visitors' expectations to engage their interest. Most visitors to the Science Museum, he said, do not visit because they're primarily interested in science and technology, but because it's a well-known museum in the vicinity of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and which ought to be visited. This type of visitor, Calvert continued, wants something simple and striking, if not amusing. They did not want to spend time reading erudite labels. Instead, they wanted to be entertained. Hence, objects should ideally be three-dimensional, should be moving, and visitors should be able to operate them. But aesthetics should not be neglected either. Attractive objects or objects displayed in an arresting way would be more efficient at getting a point across to visitors than bland ones because they would hold visitors' attention. Here, Calvert alluded to the idea that pleasure, visual or provoked by historical association, was an important dimension of what makes a display successful. He argued that the aesthetic appearance of the object and the aesthetics of presentation are also important. Visitors will stop to look at an object which is attractive in itself or which is attractively displayed. If objects are overcrowded, the visitor walks past them without looking at any. He suggested that a well-chosen object can suggest routes through displays and draw attention to other objects that might be overlooked. His expectations of visitors were interestingly minimal. He said, "Once interest in an exhibit has been aroused, there is a slight chance with certain types of visitor that they will read the label attached to that exhibit and may even go on to read about the other objects in the same group." Very interesting that he makes such a small demand, I think. Calvert then concluded his note in a rather programmatic manner. "This, then, should be our method, to attract people to an object by good showmanship, and when their interest is aroused, to make sure that the instructive explanation is easily at hand to satisfy their curiosity." This note reveals a conception of visitors as entertainment seekers, but it also indicates a belief in the notion of self-improvement, suggesting that given the appropriate motivation, visitors will want to know more about an object or a group of objects after their attention has been attracted. Museum staff gained the opportunity to put some of these kinds of theories into action, especially when the museum had temporary exhibitions, such as those on space technology, which Jean-Baptiste focused on for his paper, which came out of the project. At the time, the museum's permanent galleries looked something like this. I guess most people in the Science Museum, most people in the room know the Science Museum. You are, as it were, standing on the mezzanine floor of our new cafe here, looking towards the entrance of the Science Museum with some old familiar friends. Those are the Bolt and Watt engines, which had actually been in place since about 1924. But you can see the massed ranks of objects, the cases of engines, the classificatory sequences of development. That's what a permanent gallery looked like in the Science Museum. I think this is immediately before the Second World War. But the temporary exhibitions that curators produced or enabled to enter the museum, following the kinds of philosophy I've just been discussing, might look something like this. Now, this wasn't actually produced by the Science Museum. This was actually produced entirely by the US Information Service in collaboration with NASA. This was a traveling exhibition which showed Colonel John Glenn's capsule Friendship 7. Only 3 months after Glenn went up in space in this capsule, it was touring around Britain. And I think it came here as well after it had been in South Kensington. It did, yeah. There were certainly discussions about it coming here. So this is what the display looked like. I think this particular snap must be of the gentleman of the press at the opening. It was extraordinarily popular. It was in an empty gallery at the back of the museum. It was only there for 3 days. And 25,000 people came in 3 days. See the queue going down Exhibition Road. But just back to this picture, you can see the components of the display, the dramatic object that draws the eye, a panorama of pictures to give context. Behind it, there's a view taken from the capsule of the African coast. You can't see it in that particular view. Also the subject of a special issue of Panorama, which I might have shown you if I hadn't wanted to keep the talk fairly short. So the capsule, displayed on a sort of trolley cum podium affair, stood in front of a curved panel of photographs of the mission. There was sound of the communications between Colonel John Glenn and ground control played in the background on a loop. And visitors, like this young visitor, filed past. They were able to climb a flight of stairs to gaze into the capsule's window to see the cramped space in which Glenn had sat. So for our purposes today, the point I want to bring out is the importance of simultaneity in this display. Just like the cameras in the Cavendish laboratory meeting Curti, this display gave the viewer a sense of immediacy. They could themselves witness the latest science and technology at first hand. And only 5 people had been into space at this time. So a real spaceship was quite an event. But that sense of immediacy, I think, is a crucial way in which the cultures of television and of museum display touched in this era. But not only with touring outside exhibitions, the Friendship 7 display was succeeded 3 years later with a display of the capsule from the Gemini sequence, Freedom 7. This temporary exhibition lasted for 7 months. And here you can see Calvert's principles in action. Here is the iconic object drawing the eye. Here are the labels which the slightly interested visitor might read. They might actually look at these objects, which are the first items from the Science Museum Space exhibition, which were space collection, which were put on display here. So a very simple, very clear exhibition with a lack of clutter, with the main object leading the eye to the smaller components. It could be a sort of textbook version of Calvert's memo, even though the memo was 15 years old at this stage. What's clear is they obviously talked a lot about exhibition technique. So similarly with television, there were many and extensive discussions between the producers responsible for science programs about the form that science programs should take. And these often expressed views about the approach to the television viewer, just as Calvert's note, for example, spoke about the appeal to the museum visitor. Within television, these discussions were especially vivid in the lead up to and the early years of Horizon, which started 50 years ago in May 1964, as I explored in a recent article. Let me give you a flavour. Gordon Rattray Taylor, its editor in 1965, proposed the Horizon series is a programme about ideas, trends and issues in the field of science, and of course about people. Rather, as a Monitor does for the arts on BBC One, it tries to give the ordinary man who is not particularly science-minded but wishes to be intelligently aware of what is going on a sense of being in touch with all that is really important. What kind of world is the world of science? What do scientists talk about? So they wanted to give a general view of the culture of science, but they also wanted to be able to be newsy when they had to. So he said, when a scientific discovery of really major significance is made, something which puts the scientists themselves in a tizzy, Horizon will report it. The sort of conversation which springs up when a scientist and a non-scientific friend get talking over a beer, a coffee, or a glass of after-dinner brandy represents the sort of discussion we aim at. Finally, and in passing, Jean-Baptiste's analysis showed that even whilst museum curators and television producers worked at developing their separate formal conventions, appropriate to each medium, there were also significant similarities in the account of science and technology to public audiences via museums or television. And one unexpected strong feature that came through was that even where the subjects shown were dramatic examples of contemporary high tech, notably nuclear energy and space exploration, there was generally an emphasis in both media on domestic and homely metaphors and on the everyday nature of science and technology. There was a concern in both the museum and the television coverage of Friendship 7 on the small-scale domestic arrangements for Colonel John Glenn in his capsule, for example. And again, Jean-Baptiste showed the predominance of car metaphors in the way that space exploration was discussed. That the Friendship 7 display had more than a little of the motor show stand about it, just as programmes such as the BBC's Man in Space, Horizon, in May 1966, commences with an extended metaphor about space travel being like car travel. The astronaut Frank Borman volunteers the comparison that people can understand the problem if they imagine 2 weeks in the front seat of a Volkswagen. Okay, end of part one. So that marks the end of the well-founded and researched half of this paper. But in the outline, I promise to offer a longer view of these two media and their relations in the public culture of science. This section is considerably more gestural than the first half. I'm now going to jump forward to the 1980s and 90s, and a good reason for doing this is that there's very little published research on science television for the period from the mid-1960s, apart from contemporary analyses and critiques. Similarly, there is rather little on the history for the same period of the Science Museum, apart from 2 chapters in the volume I showed you earlier. As I mentioned, my work on the history of the Science Museum covered the period since about 1980, starting in the Margaret Thatcher period, you might say. And today I want to explore the crisis of the public culture of science in the era since then, which is palpable, I feel, in both the Science Museum and on the television of the period. This may be seen across several phases. The public understanding of science moment from 1985 up to the mid-90s, the science wars era of the second half of the 90s, and afterwards. So I'll discuss these 3 phases and their analogues in television first, and then come to the Science Museum at the end. So that first era, the public understanding of science moment. This will be familiar to lots of you. The arguments for the public understanding of science that emerged in 1985 with the Bodmer Report were designed to bolster public support for science in an era when government-funded science was being exposed to market pressures and, after the advent of the Thatcher government in 1979, a palpable squeeze on science public spending. To the Bodmer Report's authors, it seemed clear that the problem was that the general public were ignorant of science and that it was necessary for scientists, therefore, to dirty their hands by emerging from their laboratories to explain the science they did there. Public support, it was assumed, would follow. Scientists, the report averred, had ceded the ground of the public relations of science too much to professional journalists and broadcasters, people who were often more inclined to discuss environmental degradation than fundamental science. We don't have time to go into the critiques of this position that emerged very soon afterwards and which led to the turn to science dialogue after the millennium. But it's sufficient for us today to note that from the Bodmer Report episode in 1985 onwards, there emerged a whole sector devoted to science communication. The first postgraduate degree that I'm aware of in science communication was started by John Durant in the early 90s. And the first journal, also called Public Understanding of Science, was also started by him in his joint role as Professor of Public Understanding of Science at Imperial College and head of the Science Communication Division at the museum. The Science Wars era. Science Wars is the name given to the period of the public culture of science in the mid-1990s, when a few scientists aggressively denounced science and technology studies, the professional discipline within the universities, as an attack on science's license to practice. The spat famously included the jape of the physicist Alan Sokal submitting and having published in 1996 a spoof article in the cultural theory journal Social Text. The science warriors made a great deal of this intervention, but actually Social Text is a journal far away from the STS mainstream. I don't think he would have got it into social studies of science. In the realm of television, such conflicts over which accounts of science were appropriate and might therefore be aired in the public sphere had effectively been prefigured in the debacle over a programme called Crucible, the first science series on Channel 4 in 1982-3. Does anybody remember Crucible? Just one nod. It is quite a long time ago, but I think it's interesting that actually Crucible has disappeared without trace. You know, there's not a second of Crucible available on the web, for example, because I looked, because I thought it would be nice to share a clip. So it has started. You have to remember that in its startup season, Channel 4's founding ethos was not to be balanced in itself, BBC style, but to balance the remainder of television single-handedly. And there were plenty of other programmes in the first series in the first season that were like this. There was a news program called The Friday Alternative, for example, which followed the philosophy of the Glasgow Media Group. But true to this philosophy, in Crucible, television producers, guided by the great Marxist historian of science Bob Young, unhappily as it turned out, brought into the public sphere the kinds of debates about science that were familiar in university departments, but which had impinged little on Horizon, for the reason that Horizon's producers thought of themselves as journalists and prided themselves on finding their own stories, not acting as conduits for small critical university disciplines. The programmes in the single commission series of Crucible contained 2 television presentations of contemporary debates in the history of science, one on portraits of Newton, another one on the history of nature. There were programmes on the radical politics of science, including one called I'm Not Ill, I'm Pregnant, which was on the politics of obstetric technologies, and one on the low priority accorded to research into renewable energy technologies. More programmes with an air of science wars were seen on television a decade later, if you like, at the peak of the science wars crisis. Of several examples, perhaps the clearest were Adam Curtis's series Pandora's Box in 1992, and the 30th anniversary edition of Horizon, titled The Far Side. This programme featured commentaries on the concerns of the programme since its beginning by figures including post-colonial theorist Homi Bhabha, novelist Ian Banks, and politician Tony Benn. The Radio Times listing proclaimed that it celebrated Horizon's anniversary by checking on some of the programme's scientific predictions of 3 decades. In the 1960s, there was optimism that advancing technology would be a liberating force, promising exciting challenges and improvements. Scientific miracles to solve all ills were predicted. The 30th anniversary programme looks at the changes that followed and shows that not all have been for the good. Technology brought unemployment in industry. At the same time, it failed to feed the starving. Can the new communications technology now save the global village? Ultimately, it is politicians, not science, controlling the power to make technology work. That's the Radio Times billing. So you might say a distinctly down-in-the-mouth celebration. But I think the programme can be seen as the kind of outsider's commentary on science that made the science warriors so deeply uncomfortable. And then, more famously, the series Pandora's Box. I guess more people will remember Pandora's Box. This was a programme made by Adam Curtis. The subtitle of this series was 6 Fables from the Age of Science. And this indicates that this programme too had a distinctly extra scientific viewpoint, which the film critic David Thompson described as the consequences, often dangerous, of political and technocratic rationality. And I thought, if it will work, I will just play you the titles. With any luck. No, I think we're not going to get that one. Oh, there we are.
science was a grand liberating force. They believed Karl Marx had discovered the scientific laws of society, which they would now use to unlock the gates to a new world.
What year was that?
1992. So the series consisted of 6 programs. The Engineer's Plot, which you just saw the beginning of, which was about Soviet planning, To the Brink of Eternity, which was about the Rand Corporation in the States, The League of Gentlemen, which was about the failures of economists to understand the British economy, Goodbye Mrs. Ant, which was about DDT, A is for Atom, the rise and fall of nuclear power, and Black Power, Kwame Nkrumah's plan for the industrial utopia in Ghana, centered on the Volta Dam project. So Pandora's Box's account of these subjects was vastly different from the straightforward techno-enthusiasm of earlier films and television programs. The Nkrumah program, for example, contained an economic, social, and environmental critique of dam building schemes. That was a critique which had been growing in intensity for several decades before. And stylistically, as you can tell from the titles, Pandora's Box departed from documentary norms. These are very much authored documentaries, with Curtis's own voice providing the narration and interviewing witnesses. Especially its contrapunctual use of archive film displays the kind of cinematic literacy rarely seen in science documentaries. And I think this is because Curtis was not only a maker of programs about science. And I think that goes some way to explaining the different kind of cinematic literacy from the mainstream of television of these films and the successes he's made, such as The Century of the Self, for example, which went out in 2002. So this is I feel a real, so it's not only a break in terms of the type of account of science that's put across, but it's also dangerous because it's such a potent form. It's very persuasive, it's highly rhetorical. So the third of my post-1980s periods, the period after Science Wars. So after these few examples of Science Wars era science television, much of what came afterwards looks to me like retrenchment. Adam Curtis continues to make series, but it seems to me he is the BBC's single auteur documentarist who tackles science. Horizon, in common with much of the era of the BBC in the time of John Birt, moved towards a much more consumerist model. Terrestrial broadcasting increasingly became shaped by the commercial race to the bottom of a multi-channel world. The dominant concerns in production departments centred on how to retain viewers for any significant proportion of the programme. And it's generally said the availability of many channels via set-top boxes and the remote control produced this situation in which the main difficulty for producers was to make programmes that people would stay with. And across factual programming, including Horizon, producers were sent to be trained by the Hollywood narrative guru, Robert McKee, whose prescriptive ideas are based on structuring a program sequence around conflict as the dynamic of dramatic storytelling. And for the documentary departments at the BBC, the idea was that by stealing the clothes of Hollywood drama, producers would seduce viewers into sticking with the program. I should say the approach led to much discontent. I've spoken to producers who've complained that they were required by the straitjacket of the form to require on-screen participants to say particular things to suit the narrative which had already been written. Sometimes these producers interviewed for hours to get the scientist to say the right words. So, having sketched the broader scene of the emergence of science communication and the contestation in the Science Wars and beyond of what accounts of science were acceptable to various groups, let's look at the Science Museum across this era. So in this period, the Science Museum under Neil Cossons, who was director between 1986 and 2000, saw an explicit turn to a consumerist vision. Cossons announced his intentions to take a critical view of the museum's established approach in a 1987 article given the title Adapt or Die, Dangers of a Dinosaur Mentality, which he published in the BBC's generalist magazine, The Listener. And it is a very Thatcherite tone. The article starts, "The boundaries of state funding of the old-style corporatist public sector are being pushed back to put spending power and therefore choice into the hands of the people." Increased leisure time and income had created a boom in independent museums, he argued. This is what he saw explicitly as the market within which national museums too had to operate. He stated that the battlefield will be the marketplace and the casualties will be those museums that failed to adapt. Where the independents were vivid, exciting, experiential, he was thinking of Iron Bridge, and responsive to visitors' needs, the larger and well-established museums are in the weakest position. Their inflexibility, staff attitudes, and near impossibility of recapitalizing them at anything like the rate that is needed all militate against change. In retrospect, this marketized language of serving visitors also carried the potential for a more democratic, less elitist knowledge politics, as it provided an open-ended provocation to staff to focus once again on the visitor experience of displays, as we saw with Henry Calvert in 1950. In the 1990s, perhaps, there was a confluence of post-1960s liberal and left democratic ideology with consumer capitalism, the two strands expressing themselves on the one hand in more social historical displays and on the other hand with a customer charter. Neil Coston's populism was also hungry for an ideology and a methodology, and with the appointment of John Durant, that ideological base was found in the then new work on the public understanding of science. And here, two inchoate programs came together. The new discipline of science communication studies growing in momentum, and a museum looking for a sound intellectual base for its populism. The public understanding of science ethos of the science communication division under John Durant soon found expression from 1992 in a touring exhibition series called Science Box. There's a couple of examples there. That one, the one on this side is passive smoking, and this one is about Alzheimer's. And these exhibitions, which covered also the science of lasers and nanotechnology, amongst a lot of other subjects. The shows used a standard kit of display parts, and they were small, punchy, and within the public understanding of science ethos, they were admirably suited to supply content to fill the knowledge deficit of visitors. And these exhibitions are very much the ancestor of the considerably much livelier antenna science news displays, which now feature in our Welcome Wing, opened in 2000. I don't know. I think perhaps I'm too close to judge whether it's possible to detect a whiff of science wars in the museum's displays across this period in a way that's in any sense comparable with Crucible or Pandora's Box. Certainly, several displays were informed by the dominant tendencies in the history and philosophy of science and science and technology studies. I could cite Alan Morton's account of the King George III collection, which opened in 1993. This is a tide mill model which comes from that display. Alan's account in social historical style stressed the demotic pub lectures, which were the origins of much of the collection of the King George III collection, which later passed into royal hands. The previous account had been science for princes. This was science down the pub. And I could also cite an exhibition which I worked on myself, Health Matters, which opened in 1994, which in a quiet way owed as much of a debt to Latourian laboratory ethnography, Foucauldian accounts of panoptic health surveillance, as to the texture of good old-fashioned social history of medicine. So let me just draw this together a little bit. So I've sketched comparisons between science television and science museum display in two different eras. In the 50s and 60s, I've shown, drawing on a properly researched case study, how there were several similarities between the two media. There was a significant amount of reflection by practitioners in each case about how each of the respective media should work most effectively. In terms of what was shown, there was often a stress on immediacy in both media, and there was also a tendency in both cases to render the novelty of modern technology by way of domestic scale metaphors. In my rather more gestural treatment of the period since the 1980s, there's not a worked case study to report. All the same, it's clear to me that in a complex way, the emphasis on consumers, that is the hallmark of a marketized view of culture, is seen not only in television's attempt to retain viewers who want to switch between programs, but also in Neil Cossens's Science Museum that aimed to serve the visitor consumer more effectively. Both may be seen to relate to science's own new concern post-1985 with the public as potential supporters of science by virtue of being consumers of effective science communication. The response of the science warriors to accounts of science external to science itself may be seen also as a contest over the public culture of science, as an anxiety over the loyalty of the consumers of scientific culture. But let me note before you do that there's a deep lack of symmetry in the treatment of the two periods I've discussed. For the earlier period of the 1950s and 60s, I reached the conclusion that the account of science in science television was intrinsic to television, seemingly decoupled from contemporary debates about the two cultures, for example. In my book, I had reached the conclusion that scientists' attempts to gain control of science broadcasting in the late 50s and 60s had only led to a hardening of TV producers' ownership of the mystique of TV production. And I should just say as an aside, the Royal Society and the British Association for the Advancement of Science kept sending delegates to the Director General of the BBC saying, put us scientists in charge of science television, we're the only people who can do it. And the producers kept on saying, no, we're the people who know how to make television programs. Well, those interactions hardened that, so that the TV producers very much won the day there. And my work on Horizon reinforced this, because it became clear that producers had turned to precedents in television itself to decide how to represent science in the new programme that became Horizon. They just copied the arts magazine Monitor. I think we can also see that the way I've presented issues of display in the Science Museum is also an intrinsic account. It's very much about what museum curators said about the craft of display in this period. It won't have escaped your notice, but that in my treatment of the later period, all my explanations are extrinsic. They relate to Thatcherism, market capitalism, consumer culture, and the public understanding of science debate. So it's clear to me that the writing of this paper has set me a new challenge, namely to research better the intrinsic factors in the later period and the extrinsic in the earlier period. By understanding those, I believe we will be much closer to a full account of the public culture of science in the post-war world. Finally, may I say that this may well seem far distant from the curatorial business of making new galleries, accessioning and cataloguing objects and responding to visitors, which are all core elements of the curator's job. But one of my motivations for doing this work is that I believe that if we're to do our job as curators effectively, it's crucial to be able to look at our practice from some distance. And that's precisely what comparison of the kind I've explored this afternoon can help us to do, to see our choices as the products at some level of broader changes in society and culture, of which, like our predecessors, we ourselves may often only be dimly aware. Thank you.